I am 92 years old now, and I have lived in 9 different houses in my lifetime. Only one of them ever felt occupied when I knew for certain I was alone. This happened around Halloween in 1982. I was 48 years old. My husband Harold and I had bought an old house outside a small town in western Pennsylvania that summer. Our 2 oldest had already moved out. Our youngest daughter, Nancy, was 17 and still living with us. The house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway with woods behind it and an empty field on one side. It was not abandoned. It was not falling apart. It was simply old. 2 stories, dark wooden floors, a narrow staircase, 3 bedrooms upstairs, and a hallway that always seemed longer after sunset. Harold and I used the bedroom closest to the stairs. Nancy had the middle room. The smallest bedroom sat at the very end of the hall. We called it the back room. Nancy kept boxes in there. I kept spare blankets, an old sewing machine, and an ironing board near the window. Nothing about that room should have mattered, but from the first few weeks we lived there, I disliked walking past it after dark. I could never explain why. There was no strange smell. No unusual draft, no story attached to the room. It was just a small bedroom. Still, sometimes I would reach the top of the stairs and get the unmistakable feeling that someone had moved out of sight at the far end of the hall a second before I looked up. I never actually saw anyone, at least not then. It was more like arriving 1 second too late. I would stop, look toward the back room, nothing. Usually the door would be open a few inches. Then I would tell myself the same thing. Old house, old floors, old doors, nothing more. The first incident I remember clearly happened in September. Harold was at work. Nancy was at school. I was downstairs folding laundry when I heard 3 soft creaks directly above me. One, then another, then a third. They moved slowly across the upstairs floor. My first thought was that Nancy had come home early. I called her name, no answer. Then I remembered she had plans to stay after school that day. I stood beside the laundry basket and listened. Nothing. After maybe 30 seconds, I went upstairs. The hallway was empty. Our bedroom was empty. Nancy's room was empty. Then I reached the back room. Its door was almost closed. I knew I had left it open because I had carried blankets in there earlier. I pushed it wider. Nothing. Boxes, the sewing machine, the ironing board, gray afternoon light through the window. I remember standing there feeling slightly embarrassed. I actually said out loud, "It's an old house." Hearing my own voice made me feel better. I went back downstairs. About a week later, it happened again. I was washing dishes around noon when I heard one floorboard creak upstairs. Then another. Then silence. I knew nobody was home. This time I did not go upstairs. That bothered me afterward. Not because anything happened, because I realized I had already started changing my behavior because of that hallway. I simply did not want to check. By October, I had developed a habit I never told Harold about. Whenever I came home alone, I would unlock the front door, step inside, and stand completely still for several seconds. I would listen. Every time, I heard nothing, and every time, that was exactly what I wanted to hear. Harold noticed once. He asked, "What are you waiting for?" I laughed. I said, "Nothing." I was not lying. I was waiting to make sure there was nothing. Then Halloween came. October 31st, 1982. I remember the afternoon being gray and cold. Nancy was getting ready to go to a Halloween party. Harold was outside in the garage finishing a few things before winter. I was making dinner and filling a large glass bowl with candy near the front door. A little before 5, Nancy left. Maybe 15 minutes later, I carried a stack of clean towels upstairs. The house was completely quiet. I reached the top step. Then I heard something from the back room, a small sound, like the leg of a wooden chair sliding slightly across the floor. I stopped. I looked down the hallway. The back room door was open. I could see the edge of the sewing table inside. Nothing moved. I called, "Nancy?" No answer. Then I remembered she had already gone. For some reason, I stayed at the top of those stairs longer than I needed to. That familiar feeling was back, only stronger. Someone had been down that hallway. I could not explain how I knew. There is a difference between being alone and feeling alone. By then, that house had stopped giving me both at the same time. I walked toward the back room and pushed the door open a little farther. I was already turning to leave when something near the window caught my eye. For just a second, I saw a boy standing there, not moving, just standing in the dim part of the room, facing me. I froze, then I looked directly at him. There was nobody there. The room was empty. I stayed in the doorway for several seconds, staring at the same spot. I knew how little sense it made, but I also knew what I had seen. For that 1 second, I was sure someone had been standing in that room. I backed into the hallway. That was when Harold came through the front door downstairs. He called my name. I nearly dropped the towels. He came upstairs and immediately noticed my face. Harold asked, "What's wrong?" I said, "I saw someone." He looked past me. He asked, "Where?" I pointed toward the back room. Harold checked it. Then Nancy's room, then our bedroom. He checked the closets and windows. Everything was secure. He came back into the hallway. Harold asked, "What did you see?" I said, "A boy." He looked at me. I added, "Just for a second." Harold did not laugh. That was not his way. He looked into the back room again and then said, "You probably caught a shadow when you walked in." I said, "Probably." I wanted him to be right. A few minutes later, the first trick-or-treaters arrived. For the next couple of hours, the front door opened constantly. Groups came and went. I handed out candy. Harold watched television. I behaved normally, but every time I opened the door, I looked past the people standing on our porch. I kept expecting to see a small figure farther down the driveway. I never did. Nancy came home a little after 9. I did not tell her what had happened. Neither did Harold. By bedtime, I had already started trying to convince myself that he was right. A shadow, a reflection, something caught in the corner of my eye. That explanation was almost working by the next morning. For 3 days, nothing happened. No footsteps, no moving doors, no strange feeling at the top of the stairs. The house felt ordinary again, and I started to feel foolish. Then came Wednesday night. Nancy and I drove into town to visit my sister. She had been feeling under the weather, and I wanted to bring her some food and sit with her for a while. Nancy came along. Harold stayed home. He said he was tired and wanted a quiet evening. By the time we backed out of the driveway, it was already dark. There was no storm, no heavy wind, just a cold November night. The woods behind the house were black. Once our car reached the road, Harold was completely alone. He told me later that the first hour was perfectly normal. He sat in the living room with the television turned low and a newspaper folded across his lap. Around 8:30, he heard a floorboard creak upstairs. He barely noticed. Old house. A few minutes later, another board creaked, then another. Harold lowered the newspaper. The sounds were moving slowly across the floor above him. He listened. They stopped. He went back to reading. Then he heard a short scraping sound. It came from upstairs, from the direction of the back room. The same kind of sound I had heard on Halloween, something moving slightly across a wooden floor. Harold turned the television down. Nothing followed. He sat there for another minute. Then one floorboard creaked directly above the living room. That was when he stood up. He checked the front door. Locked. Then the back door. Locked. He looked through the kitchen window toward the driveway. Our car was gone. The house was completely still. He told himself exactly what he had told me. Old house. Then he looked toward the staircase. The downstairs lights were on. The upstairs was dark except for the small light over the stair landing. Harold stood at the bottom for a few seconds. He told me later that this was the first time he understood what I meant when I said the house sometimes did not feel empty. Nothing was happening, but he suddenly did not like the idea of going upstairs. Harold was not the kind of man who let a feeling decide what he did, so he went anyway. At the top of the stairs, he stopped. Our bedroom door was open. Nancy's was closed. The back room door stood partly open at the far end of the hallway. Harold called, "Hello?" He felt ridiculous as soon as he said it. Nothing answered. He checked our bedroom. Empty. Then Nancy's room. Empty. He stepped back into the hallway. A floorboard creaked inside the back room, just once. Harold looked toward the open door. Then he walked down the hallway, slowly. When he reached the room, he pushed the door all the way open. Nothing. The sewing machine was near the window. The boxes were against the wall. Everything looked exactly as it should. Harold stood there for a moment. Then he turned to leave. And that was when he saw something at the other end of the hallway, near the top of the stairs. For 1 second, there was a small dark figure standing there. Harold did not see a face. He did not see what it was wearing. He later told me he could not even swear that the shape had been completely clear, but his first thought was immediate. There was a boy standing at the end of the hall. He turned fully toward it. Nothing was there. The landing was empty. Harold stayed where he was. He looked at the staircase, then back toward the room behind him. Nothing moved. No sound came. But suddenly, he had the strongest feeling of his life that he should not stay upstairs. He told me later that frightened him almost more than the figure. Harold was a practical man. He did not believe in signs. He did not believe that a room could tell you to leave. But standing in that hallway, every part of him was telling him to get downstairs. He started walking. Halfway to the stairs, he stopped. He had the feeling that someone was behind him. Very close behind him. He did not hear breathing. He did not feel anything touch him. There was nothing dramatic like that. He simply became certain that if he turned around, someone would be standing within a few feet of him. Harold turned. The hallway was empty. That was when his composure finally broke. He did not run, but he backed toward the staircase without turning away from the hallway again. He kept watching the far end. When his foot reached the first stair, a floorboard creaked behind him. One single creak. Harold went downstairs. He put on his coat. Then he went outside. He did not wait in the living room. He did not turn the television back on. He sat in the garage with every light on until Nancy and I came home. We pulled into the driveway a little after 10. I knew something was wrong before I opened my door. Harold was already standing near the garage waiting for us. It was cold enough that I could see his breath. I got out of the car. I asked, "Why are you out here?" Harold looked at Nancy, then he looked at me. He said, "Let her go inside for a minute." Nancy gave us a strange look. I told her to take the food containers into the kitchen. She went inside. As soon as the front door closed, Harold asked me something. "When you saw that boy, where was he?" I felt my stomach tighten. I said, "In the back room." Harold looked up at the second floor. He did not say anything. I asked, "What happened?" He rubbed both hands across his face. I had been married to that man for 26 years. I had seen him angry. I had seen him worried. I had seen him under pressure. I had never seen him look the way he looked standing beside that garage. His eyes were wet, not because he was openly crying. It looked more like his body had reacted before he had decided what he felt. He said, "Give me a minute." That frightened me more than if he had shouted. Then he told me what had happened. The footsteps, the back room, the figure near the stairs, and the feeling that someone had been standing behind him in the hallway. When he finished, I asked, "You saw a boy too?" Harold looked at the house. He said, "I saw something." I asked, "Did it look like a boy?" He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "For 1 second, yes." Neither of us spoke. Finally, Harold said, "I don't want to sleep in there tonight." I said, "Neither do I." We went inside. Nancy immediately started asking what was going on. We told her we were staying with my sister for the night and would explain later. She complained at first. Then she saw Harold's face and stopped asking questions. We packed only what we needed. Harold came upstairs with me. Neither of us wanted to say why. We went into our bedroom, then Nancy's. The back room door was open at the end of the hallway. We passed it on the way up. We passed it again on the way down. Neither of us looked inside. I remember that more clearly than almost anything else. Two grown adults walking past an open bedroom and both deliberately refusing to turn our heads. We left before 11. I looked back at the house once from the passenger seat. The upstairs landing light was still on. The rest of the second floor was dark. I did not see anything in the windows. I was relieved. We stayed with my sister that night, then another. The following afternoon, Harold went back with his brother to collect some clothes and a few important things. When he returned, I asked if anything had happened. He said no. Then I asked, "Did you go upstairs alone?" Harold looked at me. He said, "No." That was the moment I knew we were not moving back. We contacted an agent and put the house up for sale before the end of November. When people asked why we were leaving after only a few months, we said the drive into town had become inconvenient. It was easier. The house eventually sold. I never went back after we moved our last boxes out. I am 92 now. Nancy is in her 60s and has a family of her own. Harold has been gone for many years. Most of the fear from that house faded a long time ago. Life does that. The years move on, children grow up, and eventually, even the things that once kept you awake become distant memories. What I miss is the life around it. Nancy still being 17, Harold sitting beside me at the kitchen table, the three of us still having so many ordinary years ahead of us without knowing how quickly they would pass. At 92, that is the strange thing about memories. Even the frightening ones can become precious, simply because the people inside them are gone or grown. I would never want to step inside that house again. But I would give anything to be 48 for just one more evening with Nancy upstairs and Harold beside me. Not because I miss that house, because I miss who was still there with me.